Hi everyone. This is BMN 502, History of Buddhism. We are in the winter quarter. Today's date is March 8, 2021. And in our class, this is the 8th session, I believe. Yeah, 8th session. And we already finished our midterm. And maybe we have one more session. Next week will be the final. Next week, next Monday is the final. So please remember, we will review what we have done, and then we'll have the final tomorrow and say goodbye to BMN 502. And I hope everyone is doing good. I have received your responses to the homework. Some of you have done good work, as I have been telling you, and some are just writing whatever they want to. Or even though the question is there, the homework is there, you are submitting something that is not related to it. So I don't know whether you are responding to my homework or somebody else's homework. So please make sure that you are working on the homework that I have given for each week. Because I cannot recognize some of you, not all, but some, they just write something and submit for the sake of submitting something. I don't think that will work. So those of you have done good work, don't worry. But the others, some of you, either you haven't either you have not understood what I said before, or you are cheating something. Whichever is that, be careful when you are submitting something. Please write your name, especially I don't know who you are. Sometimes you just email me something and I don't know where it comes from, who is responsible for sending it. So please do that. Those of you who haven't done your homework, I know some of you are still submitting, so please make sure that you finish all of them, submitting all your homework this week, because next week will be the final. So when the time for final arrives, you should have finished all your homework for the whole class. That means about 8 or 9, about 8 homework projects, not big projects, but some little responses. And that will decide how much attendance you have, how much homework you have done. So the most important thing in your class. Okay, now, last week we were discussing about, excuse me. Last week we were discussing about the origin of Mahayana Buddhism and its little development. We did not go on to extensive discussion because limited time. So the origin of Mahayana happened around the turn of the century. That is between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. That is what you may call the turn of the century. So if you count from the passing of the Buddha, it is like 450 years, 500 years later. So when Mahayana Buddhism arose, when Mahayana Buddhism gained ground in India, the new trend, what happened was it became so popular. And we were discussing about this thing last week because of the use of the common people's language at that time, the Sanskrit, and also the popularization of their new ideas. It became so attractive for the people. And the other important group, when we were discussing about the schisms or the different sects or the schools, we saw another line of schools which was recognized as Hinayana. Hinayana, smaller vehicle or lower vehicle. And that group later on, with different variations, they developed into what you may call the Theravada in today's parlance. Today we call that group Theravada. Only the existing school from the schism of the Sangha in the like 100 years later of the passing of the Buddha. Schism happened 100 years later after the passing of the Buddha, and the lineage that developed out of the schools still existing, surviving, is Theravada. And so we are going to focus on that aspect, that tradition. What is Theravada, and who are they? Where are they thriving? Where were they thriving, and where are they thriving? Like those things. And Hinayana schools or lower vehicles, they were really focusing on the attainment of arahantship. If you become an arahant, enlightened person, then you can be free from the cycle of birth and death. So your salvation, your liberation, is to overcome your greed, desire, hatred, and illusion or delusion. If you can overcome those three basic defilements, then you can become an arahant. So they talk about those things, and having become an arahant, one way, one entrance to the nirvana is becoming arahant. Or the second one, you can get rid of the samsara, you can get rid of the cycle of birth and death by attaining the Pacceka Buddha, or becoming a solitary Buddha. We were discussing this thing. And the highest option is that you can become a Buddha, Samma Sambuddha, fully enlightened one. Either becoming one of these, Arahant, Pacceka Buddha, or Samma Sambuddha, or the fully enlightened one, you can get out of this samsara. That is the basic belief in the Hinayana schools. So likewise, in Theravada tradition, they believe the same thing. The word Theravada is not the original word they used at the time of the split in the Sangha. They were using the term like Stavira, elder. Stavira means elder. So they were considered as elders. They were called elders because they were the responsible elders at the time when the schism occurred. They were the responsible elders of the community of monks. That's why they were called Stavira, or elders. And their view, their beliefs was called Stavira Vada. Vada means the belief, whatever they propounded. So Stavira Vada became one group. And that lineage, with certain variations, of course, continued up to today, up to now. And nowadays we call it Theravada. And you saw that in King Ashoka's time, King Ashoka convened a council, which is called Third Council. After the council, the main thing at the council actually was to define who were the real followers of the Buddha, who is authentic, who is close to the original teachings of the Buddha. So it is said that at the council, they asked a question, very simple question. It says, who was the Buddha? What type of believer of the Buddha? And then the correct answer they expected from the others was, Buddha was a discriminating person. Discriminating means they use the word vibhajyavada. Buddha does not give, how do I say? If something was asked from the Buddha, he did not answer directly. He analyzes the question. The Buddha, he analyzes the question and answers. So those who follow this sort of analysis, those who were following the method of analysis, they were called Vibhajyavada. So at the third council, the elders were expecting that answer from the others. Others means the other monks, different sects. If they were not giving the answer like that, then they considered they should be out of the group. It's very interesting. They should be out of the group if they cannot answer the question correctly. When you were asked the question that who is the Buddha, and then you should be able to answer, Buddha is a Vibhajyavadi. He is one who discriminates. Discriminate has a negative connotation. What it means is he answers the question with analysis, one who analyzes. So Vibhajyavada means a group who analyzes things. And that tradition, of course, after the third council, you saw that the king sponsored the spread of Buddhism. He sent 9 missionaries to different parts of the world, actually. Some of them were different parts of India, but some of the regions are different countries. So Sri Lanka received Buddhism because of that missionary activity. King Ashoka's own son and daughter, Mahinda and Sanghamitta, both of them went to Sri Lanka, Ceylon at the time, or Tambapani at the time, whatever the name you want to call, the little island. And they established this Vibhajyavada tradition because it was coming from King Ashoka at that time. The tradition also became to be known as Vibhajyavada. And later on, of course, the name was changed to Theravada. They were originally coming from the elders of the first council. They go back in the history to the first council, and they say we are coming from that tradition. And so it is called Theravada. A very interesting thing about this school is, this is the only school surviving today from the origin of the Buddha up until now, It has been surviving, thriving in the southern part of India. Usually, Theravada Buddhism is recognized as Southern Buddhism. Why Southern Buddhism? Because it is when you go to the equator, the countries where this form of practice, this tradition is popular, is south of the equator. Whereas the north of the equator, the countries on top of, above the equator, they are Mahayanist, like China, to begin with, China, Korea, Japan, all those countries, northern tradition. They call northern tradition or northern Buddhism. If someone says northern Buddhism, it means Mahayana Buddhism. If someone says southern Buddhism, it means Theravada Buddhism. So Sri Lanka became to the southern, belongs to the southern part of the region, and it is called Southern Buddhism. Some scholars use that term. But Theravada Buddhism, not just Sri Lanka, and later on, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, all those countries. Even today, those countries, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, these countries are recognized as Theravada countries, practicing Theravada. One of the great things that this school did, in fact, in Sri Lanka, of course, one of the great things that they did was they preserved the Buddha's teaching. They preserved the Tripitaka. You may remember now. They preserved it over 1500 years. Over 1500 years, they preserved it very nicely, intact, without losing anything, in memory for some time, for a long time. Because when Buddhism introduced into Sri Lanka, it was the 2nd century BCE, during the time of the Ashoka. And after that, don't think that when the monks from India brought Tripitaka to Sri Lanka, it does not mean that they took books or a form of writing to Sri Lanka. No. By now, the monks were keeping the books, not the books, keeping the Tripitaka in their memory. So it was only memory that they took to Sri Lanka as Tripitaka. And they taught it to Sri Lankan monks. They, when the tradition started there, they learned it, and they also kept it into their memory. This is very interesting. A big corpus of literature committing to memory. So they were able to do so, and they kept it in the same way for about let's say 2 centuries, about 2.5 centuries. They kept the tradition in memory. They kept all those texts in memory. And in the 1st century CE, yes, in the 1st century CE, there was a threat to the monks. The threat was a big famine. You know what famine is? Famine is that you don't have food, nothing, no way of survival. And then monks were dying in great numbers. They were not able to survive because of the lack of food. That famine continued for about 13 years, 13 long years. So the monks who were committed the Tripitaka into memory, most of them died. So they realized that if we continue to do like this, we won't be able to preserve the Tripitaka. We won't be able to continue the preservation of the teachings of the Buddha. So what they did was they decided, okay, why don't we get together and write these things in book form? All the texts that were in memory, they get together into a certain place in Sri Lanka, and they put those things into writing. That is the first time in the history where the Tripitaka was put into writing. First time. So that was done by Theravada tradition, monks of the Theravada tradition. And because of this thing, even today, we are able to have access to this body of literature called Tripitaka. And it is highly authentic, highly trustworthy, that the monks were keeping it in good memory and they were preserving it. So Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka has the reputation of preserving the Buddha's teaching in the form of Tripitaka and providing it for the next generations to come, preserving it for the next generations to come. That is one of the great things that they have done. And in Sri Lanka, of course, the Theravada tradition, with the patronage of the kings of the country, flourished. They were able to flourish in Sri Lanka, became so popular over there. And later on, there were little divisions in the country itself. Inside the country, inside the tradition in Sri Lanka, they had not big schisms, but variations. You know, nowadays this variant is a popular word. Even in coronavirus, we have COVID, we have different variations now. Some variations are deadly. Some are not that not that powerful. So anyway, the variations are usually common in any tradition. In any historical tradition, things change. So in Vibhajyavada or in Theravada tradition in Sri Lanka, they had certain variations. So two other variations occurred in Sri Lanka, but later in the history, they became united and considered one whole group. And in the history, Theravada Buddhism spread into other countries from Sri Lanka, like Myanmar. Those days it was called Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. So these 5 countries, about 5 countries, they were exchanging things. When we had difficulty, like when Sri Lanka had difficulty in preserving their tradition, they borrowed from another country, borrowed from another Theravada country. And then they had difficulty, Sri Lanka came to support them. Like that, exchanging their things, they preserved for a long time. So we have to look at this thing in a wise way. That means that don't ever think that the tradition continued in the same way across these countries. No. When a tradition goes to a particular setting, what happens is it takes the shape of that country. It takes the shape of the culture, cultural background. Excuse me. With the cultural and social backgrounds, the tradition had developments, changes that occurs everywhere, wherever it goes. And the important thing is Theravada as a tradition was able to keep their history intact, keep their, how do I say, they have done their task so proudly that they were able to influence many generations, about 2,000, 2,300 years. They were able to continue their impact, that's the word, impact on different civilizations, different cultures, different settings. But we are only paying attention to the origin of it and a little development. We are not talking about the modern period of Theravada Buddhism. Why? Because this class is about history of Indian Buddhism, right? So how it came into existence, the Theravada tradition, and how was it able to spread in the early period. So now you have to understand that Theravada tradition came out of the original sects, original two sects from the Stavira tradition, and then it continued, or it developed in the history, the early history, spreading into Sri Lanka per se, Sri Lanka at the first, and then to different other regions. That is where we were focusing. And the main thing that they have done is preserving the Tripitaka. Very important thing is preserving it and writing it down, and also having big pagodas and cultural monuments. We call them cultural monuments. Even if you go to Sri Lanka or Thailand or Burma, you can see huge architectural things, buildings and other constructions based on their teachings. So, and it helped people in many different ways. And at the beginning, last week's lecture, I mentioned that Theravada Buddhism, usually people criticize Theravada Buddhism as like a selfish tradition. People who are only focusing on their own salvation, one's own salvation, only one's own salvation. Whereas Mahayana is altruistic, or thinking about the others, and they are trying to help others while they were on the path. They are trying to liberate the others. Whatever it is, I told you last time, this tradition was able to make an indelible mark in the Buddhist history, indelible mark. So the two major traditions, Mahayana and Theravada. So Theravada is such that it started in India, and then it became popular in the southern part of the world. Southern part means the Southern Asia, Southeast Asia. We use that term, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries, it gained ground, and it still is prevailing. So that tradition. And I think that is the lecture today. You will get the homework, not big one, because you are getting ready for the final. And if you have any question, please email me, as you have been doing, some of you. So good luck with your final next week. And thank you very much for listening.